Rome is one of my favorite television shows ever made. For 2 glorious seasons spanning 22 episodes, HBO's groundbreaking historical epic paved the way for a new generation of big-budget, high-concept projects. Everything about Rome is top-notch. The casting, costumes, sets, the writing, the storytelling, and we were supposed to get so much more of it. The series creators mapped out a 5-season story arc, but famously, or infamously, I should say, HBO pulled the plug on Rome during pre-production of just its 2nd season, canceling the series. It's a decision HBO executives later admitted was a mistake. Today, we're going to explore the Untold 5-season arc of Rome, the most expensive show ever made for television at the time. That time was March 2004 when the cameras started to roll, which means this is the 20-year anniversary of the production. And suddenly I feel very old. Why was this show so expensive? And how did HBO decide to prematurely cancel it? You may be surprised to learn the decision was not simply because of the large budget. It was primarily because of a bad business partner. But what I find most interesting is what Rome's 5-season arc was supposed to look like. HBO has never revealed the original treatment, so today I'm on the hunt to assemble the puzzle pieces from a patchwork of interviews that the creators have dribbled out over the last 2 decades. We'll combine those clues with the real historical timeline to reassemble the 5-season arc audiences never got to see. There are some real surprises in store, and at least one major plot point that would have occurred in Season 4 that, frankly, I think would have been a huge mistake. But first, let's go back to the beginning. They say Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was the television show. It was 6 years in the making, and HBO very nearly didn't make it at all. Back in the early 2000s, the premium network was in the market for a splashy historical miniseries. They were taking pitches, and their first choice was not Rome. HBO preferred an Alexander the Great miniseries brought to them by none other than Mel Gibson. Now, before you laugh, just remember that in the early 2000s, Mel Gibson was box office gold. Maybe you've heard of some of these hits. He was on top of the world, and HBO wanted him to play the man who conquered the known world, Alexander the Great. But at this time, Gibson felt he was too old to portray the young Alexander, and he was instead becoming more and more interested in working behind the camera. He wanted to direct, write, and produce the miniseries, not star in it. That turned out to be a deal breaker for HBO. They weren't willing to shell out $100 million on a Mel Gibson miniseries that didn't feature Mel Gibson. But don't feel too badly for poor Mel. After moving on from Alexander the Great, he would get his turn in the directing and producing chair in 2004 with a little film called Passion of the Christ. It only went on to become the highest-grossing independent film of all time, making him fabulously rich. With Gibson moving on to his passion project, HBO still wanted to test the waters with a historical epic of their own. Next up in the pitch room, a show called Rome. Today, the man most closely associated with Rome is writer and executive producer Bruno Heller. We'll talk more about him in a moment. But Heller is not the man who created the idea for Rome or brought it to HBO. The creator of Rome was William J. MacDonald. He'd actually given a soft pitch for this concept to Ridley Scott in the aftermath of Gladiator. Scott expressed no interest personally, but shrugged and told MacDonald he should pursue it. And pursue it he did. MacDonald wrote a full-blown treatment for a show set around the rise and fall of Julius Caesar. But in a clever twist, MacDonald only envisioned Caesar as a secondary character. His main characters would be two everyday Roman soldiers, who were mentioned by name in Caesar's memoir, Pullo and Vorenus. So MacDonald now had a show to pitch, and HBO was in the market for just this kind of historical show. But MacDonald had no connections at the network. He needed an in. He called up an old co-worker from a TV show called Rough Riders, the legendary screenwriter John Milius. Milius is best known as the Academy Award-winning writer of Apocalypse Now, but he has more than a dozen films to his name. In Hollywood circles, Milius made his bones as a go-to script doctor if your movie just needed punched up with a rewrite. Perhaps you've heard of Dirty Harry, Jaws, Indiana Jones, or Saving Private Ryan. They all went to Milius's desk for script work. But William MacDonald didn't just call up John Milius because of his talents. He wanted his connections at HBO, where Milius was a known commodity. Together, MacDonald and Milius pitched Rome to the HBO brass, and when Mel Gibson walked away, Rome suddenly became HBO's second-choice option. Just last year, William MacDonald gave an interview on a podcast where he confirmed that his original Bible for Rome was 199 pages long, spanning multiple seasons. When HBO saw that treatment, they were eventually persuaded to upgrade Rome from a limited miniseries to a full-blown television show. The deal was announced in 2002. As part of that green light, they asked MacDonald and Milius to bring on a young writer, a relative unknown at the time, named Bruno Heller.
To confess, I had been working for HBO as a script doctor on various things, so I had a good sense of the kind of thing that they needed. There was a Rome that hadn't really been seen on TV before, because aside from I Claudius, which is sort of palace politics and hampered by sort of cardboard sets and the BBC budgets of that period, and is very much about the elite, a realistic show about Rome that was sociologically true and politically true and gave you a kind of sense of what Rome looked and smelt like had not really been done.
If you ever wondered how Bruno Heller wound up as the lead writer on Rome, there you have it. He was already working for HBO as an uncredited script doctor in 2002, and the network brass asked him to provide some fresh eyes on the treatment and join the team. Heller did offer many subtle but smart improvements to MacDonald's original vision, including turning Pullo from a centurion into an everyday enlisted man. But here's the thing. To this very day, over 20 years later, HBO has kept the complete 5-season treatment for Rome under lock and key. We know it exists, and according to Bruno Heller, it ultimately came to include a story arc spanning at least 5 complete seasons. As a huge fan of Rome, I've always wanted to know what that show would have looked like had HBO allowed it to continue. But of course, HBO infamously did not allow Rome to continue. Season 1 was released in 2005, and during pre-production on Season 2, before the cameras even started to roll, HBO executives told MacDonald and Heller that the show would not be renewed again. They would get their upcoming second season, but that was it. In a furious bid to bring the story to some kind of satisfying end, Heller threw out his scripts and rewrote most of the second season on the fly, condensing material from Season 3 into Season 2. And when you watch Season 2 of Rome, it's very clear that the slow burn pace of the show takes off in a frenzied, rapid-fire conclusion. It is a little bit jarring as a viewer, but I give Heller credit for trying to give audiences closure on the main characters, instead of just leaving the whole thing on some kind of cliffhanger, like some other HBO show I'm not going to mention. So why did HBO pull the plug on Rome prematurely? It certainly was not because of poor ratings or poor critical reception. Rome was very buzzy when it premiered in 2005. Audiences gave it strong reviews, and critics showered the show with awards. Season 1 took home 4 Emmys on 8 nominations. The reasoning that HBO chairman and CEO Chris Albrecht publicly offered in 2006 seemed plausible at first glance. Season 1 of Rome was the most expensive television show ever made, costing $110 million, plus marketing. That's about $175 million in today's dollars. Not chump change, even in our inflated landscape of skyrocketing TV budgets. And for that budget, HBO got solid but not record-setting ratings. Rome averaged 2.5 million viewers per episode, which is about half as good as Band of Brothers, but slightly better than Deadwood. So you could argue that HBO wasn't getting as much bang for the buck as they might have hoped, given Rome's record-setting cost. Furthermore, HBO pointed to a second challenge. The cost of Rome had been shared by two other networks, BBC in the UK and Ria Italia in Italy. HBO's deal with these partner networks was apparently just a 2-year commitment, and neither one of those networks seemed keen to continue into year 3. HBO decided to pull the plug on Rome.
The crew and the actors and producers have been together for almost 3 years now, and very much a family. So I think the great moment from this last year, the final season, was that personal moment for everyone of finishing the show and being all together and saying, this is it. So there was a huge kind of sigh of, relief, sadness, melancholy, happiness when we checked the gate on that last shot.
Want to give yourselves a round of applause?
And so, in 2006, Rome ended after 22 episodes over 2 exceptional seasons. End of story. Or is it? HBO chairman Chris Albrecht may have offered the Hollywood news media a plausible reason for Rome's cancellation, but in the years since 2006, we've come to learn that was not the full story. Yes, the BBC and Ria Italia could have walked from their commitments, but they were very junior partners. The BBC only contributed $15 million to the budget, Ria Italia even less. So HBO had always been shouldering 80% of the cost on its own. The possibility of losing these two junior partners was really not as significant as Chris Albrecht may have let on. There was actually a third partner, Albrecht never mentioned by name in the cancellation announcement, and it's that third unnamed partner who proved far more problematic.
We chose to shoot in Rome at Cinecittà Studios for a number of reasons. Technically, it's one of the great studios in the world. It's 20 acres just outside Rome.
It's famous because it's associated with the greatest Italian directors, and probably most famously of all with Fellini. Cleopatra was also shot there. So, it's not just great Italian films, but gigantic epic films, international co-productions and so on have been shot there as well.
So it has a great culture and tradition and history of high-level filmmaking.
And the other thing that Cinecittà has is the back lot. Huge, gigantic, clear open space at the back, which of late has been extremely popular with international production as well. So 2 of the movies that had just shot before we went there were Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York, and Mel Gibson had also shot The Passion there. And of course it's so huge, it was one of the only places where we could actually create the back lot set, the 5-acre set.
You may be surprised to learn that Rome was filmed, in Rome. The show was shot at Cinecittà Studios, the largest film studio in Europe. Fun fact, Cinecittà was founded in 1937 by this guy. Maybe you've heard of him. Anyway, when HBO settled on Cinecittà, they went about building a mammoth set of ancient Rome, including entire city blocks. The set spanned more than 5 acres of the backlot. When you watch the show, you're looking at practical sets with full interiors and exteriors. It's not green screen, it's real.
This is the most important new addition that we've made to the set for season 2. And what we're looking at here is the area that we are calling the Aventine Collegium area. This is where all the stuff that comes into Rome arrives. It all comes up the river and it's all unloaded on the Aventine. And so this stuff would have been absolutely chock-a-block with fabulous things to get your hands on, to steal, to fence, to sell on in the black market and all the rest of it.
The original vision was to do the city as it really would have looked, which is gritty and grimy and dirty and smoky, as opposed to the cinematic cliche of Rome, which is marble halls and very clean and majestic. For people at the time, it was, the first wonder of the world. It was huge and immensely impressive. But if you were on the streets, it would look dirty and grimy and noisy and chaotic.
And you're going to see this in all its glory in rather dramatic circumstances. We see a walk which Varenus and Pullo do together, and they come out of the clubhouse and they walk through this area which is entirely packed and filled with extras, all doing their unloading and all the rest of it. And they come up the steps that I'm standing on now and walk up here past camera. And it's one of the most, the biggest scale shots that we'd be doing probably in the whole season, and certainly in that episode, which is a fabulous reveal of this whole area down here.
The incredible, extensive sets are a big reason why the show cost $110 million. All of that cash was front-loaded into the first 2 seasons to help build out a set that ideally would have been used over several seasons, amortizing the cost over time. During Rome's production, from 2004 to 2006, it was always whispered that filming in Italy wasn't just expensive, it was troublesome. And in the years since Rome's cancellation, those whispers became louder, and stories started to emerge about how business was conducted at Mussolini's old studio. Actor Kevin McKidd, who played Lucius Varenus, recalled one story. I don't know how many tons of scaffolding was used to build that set, but I remember one of the earlier conversations was, we need to buy this much scaffolding, and the people at Cinecittà were like, you can't buy that much scaffolding, but you can rent it from my brother. In a 2020 interview with Den of Geek, Bruno Heller offered an even more dramatic story. At one stage, the Italian government issued arrest warrants, or provisional arrest warrants, for all the fiduciary partners of the show. And that's a sort of standard Italian business practice, but when buttoned-down, straight-laced lawyers from New York are flying out to Rome and discovering this is how business is done, people were spooked. It's Italy, I love it, and it's part of the culture, but you were there to be picked over, and for them to, in a completely formal and legitimately legal way, take as much money out of the production as possible. HBO's nightmare experience being grifted by their Italian production studio became the stuff of legend back in Hollywood, so much so that no American television show from any network, HBO or otherwise, would return to Cinecittà for more than a decade after Rome. Before anyone accuses me of bashing Italy's most venerable studio, I do want to emphasize that all the actors and HBO's unit crews had nothing but praise for their day-to-day Italian counterparts. The Italian staff working on the production was, by all accounts, skilled and passionate about the show.
It's amazing. The art department are amazing. Anytime I walk on a new set, I just think they're so talented. It looks so beautiful.
It's incredible. The craftsmanship in Italy is second to none. You can see it right here. It's every tiny square inch is completely detailed. There's nothing. It's completely faultless.
It's mind-blowing. I mean, it never ceases to amaze me when I just walk out here. It's just like living in a fairy tale.
The problem working with Cinecittà was never the Italian production team. It was the executives. In Italy, skimming a few $1 million from a production to line some pockets and grease local politics was just considered standard operating procedure. But no one warned the executives from HBO that's how business was done at Cinecittà. So why was Rome canceled after 2 seasons? It was not simply a matter of a large budget. It was also a bad cultural and business fit between 2 foreign companies. HBO, quite simply, no longer wanted to be beholden to what they considered unsavory business practices at Cinecittà. And how can you blame them? Almost immediately after Season 2 ended and Rome formally concluded its run, HBO executives realized they may have made a mistake. even with all the hassles and costs of dealing with their Italian counterparts, because so far we have not talked about one of HBO's biggest revenue streams in the early 2000s, DVD sales. A show like Band of Brothers made bank on DVD sales. That miniseries reportedly earned HBO over $700 million since 2001. That is a major income source. Remember, folks, this was before the days of on-demand streaming. Different times. Back then, after a show aired on HBO, there was a 6-month lag in getting DVD box sets onto shelves, and an additional lag as the bean counters in accounting could generate reports to circulate in the C-suite. Remember, HBO had already made the decision to cancel Rome before Season 2 even started to film. By the time that season finished filming, HBO executives were digesting the sales data on Rome's Season 1 DVD box sets, and the numbers were staggering. Despite modest viewership on HBO, Rome was a bona fide cash cow in the DVD market. But the scope of Rome's financial success arrived too late for HBO to reverse course. Any second thoughts about reversing their decision were further extinguished by a shocking fire that broke out on the backlot of Cinecittà Studios in 2006. About a third of Rome's magnificent set was lost in an accidental blaze. And more to the point, by now, all of the actors had already been released from their contracts, and most had signed on with other shows around Hollywood. Getting such a large ensemble cast back together just would have been impossible from a scheduling and a contractual perspective. Tragically, HBO had rushed to judgment too soon on Rome, canceling the show just as it was taking off in popularity and massive international DVD sales. What could have been? Which brings us to the question of the day. A question that has teased me ever since Rome ended. What was supposed to have happened to these characters and this incredible story? What if HBO hadn't pulled the plug so soon, and William MacDonald's 199-page treatment was properly made over 5 full seasons? Let's start with what we know.
The first season is as originally planned. The second season is what I came up with after we knew before we made that we weren't going to get a third season. That's one of those odd things about writing for TV. You don't know when you get to end things normally. The second season was a compromise between wanting to tell the story in a leisurely, measured form. As you know, there's a huge, wonderful, rich, sordid, dramatic history that goes on between the 2 seasons, or in and out of the 2 seasons, but we simply didn't have time for, and I thought we needed to get to that apotheosis of Octavian as the end, which meant it had a very different feel, which, is okay.
The season 2 that we were supposed to get, had HBO not canceled Rome, would have ended, according to Heller, with the deaths of Brutus and Cassius. This occurred in episode 6, but ideally would not have occurred until episode 10, allowing for a slower pace more akin to the first season. Obviously, audiences never got a season 3, but Heller did show us the major story beats he intended to cover by cramming those into the last 6 episodes of his rewritten final season. The falling out between Antony and Octavian would have gotten a lot more time to develop across a true third season, ending with Actium and the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra. So everything that we got to watch in 22 episodes was intended to unfold over 30 episodes across 3 separate seasons. But then what? After the final triumph of Octavian, how would Rome have continued for 2 more full seasons? As it turns out, Bruno Heller and William MacDonald left us a clue in plain sight. At the end of the show, we see Titus Pullo taking custody of a young boy named Caesarion. This is Cleopatra's illegitimate son with Julius Caesar. Caesarion is a real historical figure, and one Octavian has quietly murdered to remove a possible claimant to his bloodline. But in the TV show, Caesarion is whisked away to safety by Pulo, and some other poor Egyptian boy is killed instead, fooling Octavian into thinking that he's killed off his uncle's bastard. The TV show heavily implies that in their version of events, Caesarion is not Julius Caesar's actual son. He's actually Titus Pulo's son, after Pulo sleeps with Cleopatra. And while that does sound a bit soap opera-y, if you know your Roman history, then you're aware that there were questions at the time about Caesarion's legitimacy, and whether Cleopatra was simply using the boy as a political tool. The show, implying Pulo as Caesarion's real father, isn't quite as far-fetched or silly as it may seem. Okay, why are we talking so much about Caesarion? Well, because he was intended to be a major character in Season 4. William MacDonald, the original creator of Rome, who wrote that 199-page treatment for the story, gave a rare interview on a Rome rewatch podcast called Raising Standards. In that interview, he talked about Caesarion's pivotal future role.
If you'll recall the last episode of Season 2, he says, "Let me tell you about your father." And they're walking along, and he puts his arm over, right? That's where we were going. Caesarion goes with Pulo, or with Varenus to Scotland, and they disappear. He goes back to where his accent is from. Originally, it was going to be the Tattenberg Forest, Tattenberg, right? Yeah. And there are lots of reasons why we didn't want to glorify Germans. Just politically in this town, it's pretty rough. So I said, well, what about Scotland? I'm Scottish. I know about it. Hadrian built a wall, ultimately, to keep these people out. They're so crazy. The son goes with Pulo. Well, guess what? Octavius orders him to assassinate the leader of the rebellion. So he has to go and kill his son, his biological son. That's why we were setting this up, to get us there. And that, of course, then enters Pulo into the world of Scotland in the first century, and all sorts of great things were going to happen then. We were going to lose a little bit of the ladies in Rome because everything kind of moved, but that was the theory there.
Wow. Okay, there's a lot to unpack in that podcast clip. According to MacDonald, after Octavian's final victory over his rivals, he will appoint Pulo to his new Praetorian Guard. Pulo will then travel to Scotland with his son, who is secretly Caesarion, and spend Season 4 embroiled in the politics of the Scots in the Roman province of Britannia. Caesarion would grow into some kind of local Scottish rebel leader, and I heard a very quick mention that Varenus might be with Pulo on this adventure. The emotional climax of Season 4 would be Octavian ordering Pulo to murder his own son in order to put down the rebellious Scottish threat. That is a lot to digest, and I have to say, I don't like it. I think this would have been a narrative misadventure for several reasons. Let's start with the plot issues. Why would Octavian make Pulo the captain of his personal bodyguard, only to then send him all the way to a distant corner of the empire in Britannia? Praetorians are bodyguards. They remain with the emperor. Moreover, I don't see how a young Caesarion would become a respected leader among the Scots, a completely alien culture to his own, over the course of just 6 or maybe 8 episodes? That's a very forced plot point, and it does not make sense for his character. Speaking of characters, why would Varenus be on this mission? His character arc was intended to be focused as a budding politician in Rome. And yes, I know Varenus dies in Season 2, but he was not intended to be killed off that early in the story. He was always intended to have a tragic fate. More on that later, but he was going to survive through Season 5. Shipping him with Pulo off to Scotland only stalls Varenus' character arc. MacDonald also mentioned in that clip that the Scottish detour would have meant less focus in Rome and the women of the narrative. That would have been a major mistake. The female characters are a big part of the success of the show. Polly Walker is not only my favorite character, she was also Bruno Heller's favorite character. Radically shifting the story to a remote, far-flung corner of the empire for a melodrama about Pulo and his son would have been, in my view, a grave storytelling error. And here, I do think it's worth mentioning that Bruno Heller has never said anything about this whole Scottish plot point. As Rome went on, Heller's role in the show continued to grow considerably, so an ultimate decision on the Season 4 arc may not have even been MacDonald's call to make. What do we know from Heller? Well, for Season 5, we know that he saw Pullo and Varenus venturing to Judea around the birth of a certain historical figure named Jesus of Nazareth. Octavian was the emperor of Rome at that time, so those events would neatly have fallen into the middle of his reign. And we can find evidence of Heller setting the table very early in the series for that future foray to the Holy Land. Do you remember Timon, Attia's hired muscle and fixer? Timon was a Roman Jew, and his religious awakening was a storyline in the second season. In fact, the last time that we saw Timon, he was leaving Rome with his family, heading for Judea. It's pretty cool to rewatch the series and see how the writers were setting up future storylines so early in the show. No doubt that characters like Pullo or Varenus would have encountered Timon again in Judea in Season 5. From the very outset, Bruno Heller seems to have had his eye on the endgame. And we do know exactly how the showrunners saw a 5-season run of Rome ending. In the years since Rome concluded, both MacDonald and Heller confirmed the series would end with Octavian, by now a deified Caesar Augustus, ordering Titus Pullo to kill himself. A very dark, grim final beat.
Well, the whole thing was bookended. The original thing I wrote started with an old man, because Pullo lived till he was 88, and he's sitting by a river with his granddaughter, and the Praetorian Guard arrives. They say, "Sir," because he's the first Praetorian, right? We'll go back to why that means something in Season 3. And they order his suicide. And why? Because Pullo's writing the real account. He's been scribbling down. And what he's saying is, well, the emperor got buggered by these German guys when he was 12, and he was scared to death, and the emperor doesn't want any of this to come out.
Ray Stevenson in old age makeup, wandering out of a beautiful villa in the Tuscan countryside and saying to make sure you give that goat to, we owe that goat to a neighbor. And then he's off to kill himself because he's been told to kill himself by Augustus Octavian because he knows too much about the whole story of Octavian's life. And then we then go into the show as written. We didn't do that, and enough time has passed to say the reason that we didn't do that is smart studio politics. In order to get back to that starting point, they were committing to a 7-year run. There was a question that was a kind of hostage to fortune that needed to be answered, and they don't like to do that sensibly. And it also gave Ray Stevenson way too much power.
As you heard in that interview, this scene of Pullo taking his own life on Augustus's orders was originally going to be the very first scene of the whole series. We never got that scene, but it does tell you how the creators saw Rome ultimately ending. A 5-season story arc would basically track the life of Octavian, starting with him as a young boy and culminating in Octavian becoming Rome's first true emperor. So where would the major characters of the TV show have ended up after 5 full seasons? Based on where we know the creators wanted the show to end, Octavian would still have been alive, but perhaps nearing the end of his rule. Pullo would have had his own death implied, Tony Soprano style, in the show's final cutaway scene. But what about some of the other key characters? We know Octavian outlived his mother Attia, his sister Octavia, and his best friend Agrippa. We also know from creator William MacDonald that Lucius Varenus, played by Kevin McKidd, was always intended to meet a tragic end. MacDonald saw Varenus as a way to examine the impossibly hard life of a Roman soldier.
I come from a military family. At the time, we were engaging in, I think, absolutely absurd adventures in the Middle East. I work in the Middle East. I've seen a lot of that. I kind of was like, what is the effect on these guys? We're abandoning these people. They come back. They're missing pieces of the. And what is their life like? My father was in World War II, and grandfather, they were United States Marines. So I just thought, what is the soldier's existence? Well, there's your 20 years service. You retire after 20 years, not 4 years, not 3 years, not Israel 2 years or Switzerland 2 years, 20 years. What does service really mean to these people? Are you just fodder? And I thought that would be an interesting thing to investigate. The home life was mirrored on, home lives that I was reading about. A lot of that was really outlined by me. I mean, I did a 199-page Bible. I mean, it's got dialogue, it's got everything in it. But the actual grunt day-to-day was really Bruno. I can't take that away from him. He's a good man. I just think we need to put stuff on television that starts to educate some people. No one knows anything about anything anymore. I'm very proud of it. I think we pulled off something that was really great. I think it set a bar that is a great bar.
Vorenus is implied to have died in Season 2 of the TV show, which tells me that he almost certainly would have met a similarly tragic end in Season 5, somewhere during or after the Palestine arc. When you think about it, the intended ending of Rome's pretty dark. The main leads would have all been dead, with Augustus as the last man standing. And that is precisely the message it seems Heller and MacDonald always wanted the show to convey.
History is essentially an extended cover-up of terrible crimes. I don't say that in a moral tone, that's what makes it fun to explore. Basically, the gag was that these two guys were there in the backstage to all the shenanigans that went on in history, and behind every great fortune is a great crime.
Okay, so by now you've heard from showrunners Bruno Heller and William MacDonald on the themes and the story beats they intended to explore in future seasons. I think it's time for us to have some fun and assemble those pieces into a proper outline. I'll use real historical events from Octavian's life and weave them into the notes that Heller and MacDonald provided us. Our speculative story reconstruction is a bit less speculative than you might think, because we know our starting point and our end destination. Heller has already told us that Season 3 was intended to end with the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, and the overall series would end late in Octavian's reign as Augustus, with the elderly Titus Pullo almost 90 years old. The real Octavian died in 14 AD, which means that Seasons 4 and 5 of Rome could span a period of approximately 40 years. That's a long time for 2 seasons of television, so I'm going to condense that timeline in my own proposed outline. We can use the historical life of Octavian as the spine or backbone of that outline. And that's why, right out of the gate, I want to flip the intended Season 4 and 5 arcs. MacDonald had told us that his original Bible had the disaster of the Teutoburg Forest in Germania set for Season 4, and Heller said Season 5 would be around the birth of Jesus in Palestine. 2 problems there, guys. First, it doesn't make any sense historically. Second, it is a missed narrative opportunity. Let's start with the history. Teutoburg occurs in 9 AD, very late in Augustus's reign. It's only 5 years before his death. That means that the time jump between Seasons 3 and 4 of Rome would be massive, like almost 40 years. Also, in case you haven't done the math, the birth of Jesus Christ happens between the battles of Actium and Teutoburg. So this means that we need to rearrange the last 2 seasons of the show in order for the historical timeline to make any sense, and still cover the beats that the creators intended. Not only does this help us stay true to the history, it also provides better storytelling opportunities. There's a really important character that we can introduce who ties both of these seasons together perfectly. And it's a name I've already mentioned. Publius Quintilius Verus. Yeah, that guy. Guess where Verus made a name for himself before he got killed leading 3 legions into an ambush in Germania? Judea. I know, the story is so perfect it almost writes itself. In our hypothetical Season 4, Pulo and Caesarion don't need to travel all the way to Britannia. Sorry, that was kind of a dumb idea anyway, in my opinion. It makes far more sense for them to stay in the eastern Mediterranean, and instead find themselves in Judea. The inciting incident early in the season would probably be the death of Herod the Great, and the political chaos that erupts afterward. It's a fabulous bit of real-life drama for our characters to get tangled up in, and, well, guess who could help them find some trouble? Timon. That earlier storyline already sent him to the Holy Land, and it's precisely where we can meet him again, drawing Pulo and Caesarion into the explosive Jewish revolt. And whatever drama William MacDonald may have wanted to explore between Pulo's love for his son versus his loyalty to Rome and Octavian could still very much be in play in my reworked setting. The Jewish revolt is also where we could introduce our brand new character, Varus. The man who will later die in the dark forests of Germania is sent by Octavian to serve as the Roman governor of Syria, and it's Varus who brutally and quite efficiently puts down the Jewish revolution, crucifying some 2,000 people as part of his violent crackdown. Varus is not some random nobody. We know a lot about him as a historical figure. He even served alongside one of Octavian's stepsons as consul, as part of a long, distinguished career. And he has a family backstory that's ripped right out of a Hollywood script. Varus's father fought against Julius Caesar in the Civil War and died alongside Brutus and Cassius at Philippi. Recall that was the intended climax of Season 2. So there are just way too many character connections for us to not include Varus as a supporting character in the final seasons of Rome. While Varus, Pulo, Caesarion, and Timon get their hands dirty in Judea, I would devote the majority of Season 4 back in Rome, where Octavian will be sniffing out plots against him while tackling his gravest challenge, securing an heir. Octavian only had one biological daughter, and he spent the entire second half of his life testing, developing, and adopting every male relative he could find. I don't have time in this video to tell you the full story, but let's just say that it's full of family drama, rivalries, tragedy, and political plotting. It is the perfect material for a TV show, and it would offer prominent show roles to Octavian's sister, Octavia, his wife Livia, his only daughter, Julia, and his best friend, Agrippa. It would also set the stage for us to introduce his grandsons and his stepsons. I think that Season 5 of Rome would set up perfectly for the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, which would also be our season climax. It's late in Octavian's life, and it represents a real moment of political and personal crisis. Season 5 is where we could hammer home the dark themes that Heller and MacDonald wanted to explore. By this time in his rule, Octavian is greedily overstretching Rome's ambitions, plunging deep beyond the Rhine into the heart of Germania. One of his adopted heirs and favored heirs, Drusus, dies on campaign, trying to fulfill Octavian's ambitions. We could actually see that loss in Season 4. In my version of Season 5, Drusus's brother, Tiberius, would be sent to Germania, and he assesses that the effort to expand Rome's borders beyond the Rhine is not worth the cost. Tiberius and his stepfather Octavian, they do not agree on this strategic vision. And when Tiberius is called away from Germania, guess who replaces him? Octavian's old pal Varus. We know that Varus will famously meet his end in Germania in a disastrous defeat that forever shatters the dream of Rome annexing this territory. There's just so much dramatic storytelling opportunity here, where our historical and our fictional characters could all logically converge for the series climax. In fact, I would send both Varenus and Pulo to Germania for that final season. and I'd probably have Varenus disappear, presumably killed alongside Varys at the nightmare ambush in the Teutoburg forest, thus completing the tragic arc that William MacDonald said he wanted to portray for that character. And what of Pullo? Well, as a Praetorian, I would have him accompany Tiberius, which not only puts Pullo front and center in the action, it also gives us a plebeian perspective on the tension between Octavian and Tiberius. In case you don't know the history here, Tiberius is the man who ultimately becomes the second emperor of Rome. Hopefully, my little creative foray gives you just a taste of the show that Rome could have been. Rome isn't just a fascinating window into real history, it's also a fascinating window into modern television history. It was the biggest budget show ever made at the time, and it paved the way for a new generation of big swings that we know as peak television, or the golden age of television. An age that's actually ending right now as I make this video in 2024. But that's a topic for another time. Today, I simply want to pay homage to the show that started it all, and set the bar so high for all of the big budget dramas that followed. Long live the Republic, and long live Rome. If you want to see the guys here at Little Wars TV play out one of the greatest battles in Roman history, Actium, click here to watch our tabletop wargame.